June 1934. Cambridge, England. Late evening. Rain taps softly against the leaded windows of Trinity College, blurring the glow of gas lamps along the courtyard. Inside a cramped student room, cigarette smoke hangs thick in the air, curling toward the ceiling as a small group of young men lean close together, voices low, urgent, convinced they are witnessing the birth of a new world. At the center of them sits Harold Kim Philby. He is 22 years old, well-dressed, calm, listening more than he speaks. Outside, Britain still clings to the illusion of stability. Inside Europe, something far darker is stirring. Hitler has taken power in Germany. Fascism is spreading. To many young intellectuals, democracy feels weak, compromised, already failing. Philby does not pound the table. He does not shout slogans. He nods. He asks careful questions. And when he speaks, it is with quiet certainty. Communism, he says, is the future. For the men in that room, it feels like rebellion. For Moscow, it will become an investment of incalculable value. Philby's path to espionage does not begin in shadows. It begins in privilege. He is the son of St. John Philby, EAG, an eccentric British colonial officer, scholar, and Arabist with deep ties to the Middle East. Kim grows up surrounded by power, diplomacy, and access. He learns early how the British establishment thinks, speaks, and protects its own. At Cambridge, he learns something else: how to belong. The Cambridge Apostles, the debating societies, the intellectual salons. These are not just clubs. They are pipelines into the British state. The men who sit in these rooms will one day run embassies, ministries, and intelligence services. Philby understands this instinctively, and so does the Angvdu-Yanstar, the Soviet secret police. When a Soviet handler finally approaches him, there is no dramatic recruitment scene. No threats, no money, only a proposition. You will live your life exactly as you are meant to live it. The handler explains. You will rise. You will be trusted. And when the time comes, you will serve history. Philby accepts without hesitation, not because he wants power, but because he wants to win. His instructions are simple and devastatingly clever. Philby must not remain an open communist. That would be useless. Instead, he must do the opposite. He must become a conservative. So he cuts his ties. He abandons leftist groups. He grows a small mustache. He cultivates the image of a reliable, anti-communist English gentleman. He even flirts with fascist sympathies in journalism assignments, carefully crafting a record that will later clear him of suspicion. It is not an act, it is a transformation. By the late 1930s, Philby is already doing what great spies do best: becoming invisible. By being exactly what others expect. September 1939, London. Air raid sirens cut through the city as Britain enters the Second World War. Sandbags line the streets. Windows are blacked out. And inside Whitehall, the machinery of intelligence accelerates rapidly. Britain needs men who understand Europe, men who speak languages, men who hate communism. Kim Philby fits perfectly. He is recruited into MI6, the Secret Intelligence Service. At first, his role is modest: analysis, reports, liaison work. But war has a way of accelerating careers, especially for men who appear competent, loyal, and unflappable under pressure. Philby excels. He is courteous, disciplined. He remembers names. He never appears ambitious. And he never forgets who he is really working for. During the war, MI6 is obsessed with one overriding concern: Soviet intentions. The USSR is an ally, but a dangerous one. Stalin is unpredictable. His intelligence services are ruthless, and Britain is desperate to know what Moscow is really planning once the war ends. Philby is assigned to Ukor's section, the department responsible for counterintelligence against the Soviet Union. It is a promotion so perfect it borders on absurd. The man secretly working for Moscow is now in charge of hunting Moscow's spies, and no one sees the irony. Every morning, Philby walks into his office carrying a leather briefcase. Inside are reports from across Europe, agent names, safe houses, operational plans, men and women risking their lives behind enemy lines. He reads them carefully. Then he memorizes what matters. At night, sometimes days later, he passes that information to his Soviet contacts. Not hurriedly, not carelessly, but with surgical precision. He does not give Moscow everything. He gives them exactly what they need. Networks disappear. Operations collapse just before success. Agents are arrested within hours of making contact. In London, explanations are found. Bad luck, poor tradecraft, enemy efficiency. No one suspects the man writing the summaries. By the time the war ends in 1945, Philby's reputation is unassailable. He has served Britain faithfully. He has fought communism from the inside. He has the scars of long hours and the confidence of men who trust him with secrets. And now, a new war is beginning. The Cold War. In Washington, D.C., the city hums with a new kind of tension. The Soviet Union has detonated its first atomic bomb. China is on the brink of communist revolution. And American intelligence is expanding at a pace no one fully controls. Philby arrives as MI6's senior liaison to the CI. It is one of the most sensitive posts in Western intelligence. Every day, American officers brief him on covert operations against the Eastern Bloc. Polish resistance groups, Ukrainian nationalists, anti-communist cells inside the Soviet sphere. Philby listens, nods, asks helpful questions, and sends the information east. The consequences are catastrophic. Agents parachuted into Eastern Europe are arrested almost immediately. Radio operators vanish. Entire resistance movements are rolled up before they even begin. In CIA headquarters, confusion turns into dread. Someone is betraying them, but no one suspects the British gentlemen pouring their drinks. Philby is now at the height of his power. He has achieved what no spy before him ever had. Total trust from the enemy. He moves freely between London and Washington. He advises, he reassures, he shapes strategy. And all the while, Moscow watches Western intelligence bleed itself dry. Men die because of him. Some are executed. Others disappear into labor camps. Their names never make the newspapers. Philby knows this, and he continues anyway. Because to stop now would be to admit that the perfect cover has worked too well. And because in espionage, the most dangerous moment is not the betrayal itself, but the moment someone begins to ask why everything keeps going wrong. That moment is coming, slowly, inevitably. Spring 1951, Washington, D.C., early morning. The coffee had gone cold hours ago. Inside a secure room at CIA headquarters, a handful of officers leaned over a large wooden table scattered with folders, ashtrays overflowing, maps pinned to corkboards along the walls. No one spoke. They didn't need to. The evidence sat in front of them, thin and fragmented, but impossible to ignore. Another network in Eastern Europe had gone silent. Another radio operator had vanished after transmitting just 2 messages. Another operation had collapsed with near-perfect efficiency. This wasn't bad luck anymore. It was pattern. But the CIA had spent years building covert networks behind the Iron Curtain. Couriers, radio men, resistance leaders, all carefully vetted, trained, and inserted at enormous risk. And now, one by one, they were being erased, not compromised slowly, not partially exposed, but dismantled with surgical precision. Someone, somewhere, knew too much. Across the table, a young counterintelligence officer finally broke the silence. And this keeps happening before operations even get moving. Heads nodded. The question no one wanted to ask hung in the air. Who's talking? The Americans did what intelligence services always do when faced with uncertainty. They turned inward. Background checks were reopened. Clearances reviewed. Old assumptions questioned. But suspicion, once unleashed, has a way of spreading beyond evidence. It crept into conversations, into pauses, into glances exchanged across conference rooms, and slowly, inevitably, it drifted toward the British. The CIA trusted MI6. They had fought together in the war, bled together, shared secrets. But trust, in intelligence, is always conditional. And when operations fail repeatedly, conditions change. Files were pulled, names highlighted, patterns examined, and one name appeared far too often, a Philby. At first it felt absurd. Kim Philby was the most anti-communist man in the room, at least on paper. He had built his career hunting Soviet spies. He had impeccable credentials. And he was British, which, to many Americans, still meant something. But counterintelligence does not run on sentiment. It runs on probability, and the probability that so many failures could occur without inside knowledge was shrinking rapidly. In London, MI6 sensed the shift before it was confirmed. The questions from Washington became sharper, more detailed, less friendly. Requests for clarification multiplied. Operations were delayed while reviews were conducted. Philby noticed all of it. He always did, but he showed nothing. Outwardly, he remained the consummate professional. He attended meetings, shared drinks, offered reassurance. Privately, he began adjusting his reporting to Moscow. Not panicked, not dramatic, just cautious. He warned his handlers that the Americans were growing suspicious, not of him specifically, but of the system. And that made the situation volatile. Moscow listened carefully, because this was the moment that separated great spies from dead ones. May 1951, London. The first crack appeared. Two men, Guy Burgess and Donald MacLean, both British officials and both Soviet agents, vanished. They did not resign. They did not announce anything. They simply disappeared. Within weeks, they resurfaced in Moscow, alive, protected. The shock in Whitehall was immediate and devastating. If Burgess and MacLean had escaped, then someone had warned them. And if someone had warned them, then the betrayal went higher than anyone had imagined. Eyes turned quietly but unmistakably toward Philby. Burgess had been his friend, his drinking companion, his frequent guest. The coincidence was impossible to ignore. Philby was questioned, not aggressively, not publicly, just enough to remind him that the walls were closing in. He answered calmly, consistently, with the confidence of a man who knew exactly how much truth to reveal and how much to bury under politeness and credibility. And once again it worked, for now. But something fundamental had changed. The Cold War was no longer just about East versus West. It had become a war of trust versus doubt, and doubt, once planted, never stops growing. The perfect cover was still intact, but the cracks were beginning to show. Summer 1951, London, early evening. The pub was loud in the way only London pubs could be. Voices overlapping, glasses clinking, cigarette smoke thick enough to blur the edges of the room. Kim Philby stood at the bar, pint in hand, laughing at a remark he had already heard a dozen times before. He laughed easily, too easily. Across the room, two MI6 officers watched him without appearing to do so. Their eyes never met his directly. They didn't need to. The decision had already been made. Philby was no longer invisible. Inside MI6 headquarters, the atmosphere had shifted from collegial to cautious. Doors that once stayed open were now closed. Files were requested for reference and returned days later with new pencil marks in the margins. Conversations lowered when certain people entered the room. No one accused Philby outright. There was still no proof. And in intelligence, proof was everything. Honker. The problem was that Philby had designed his life to survive exactly this moment. He had anticipated suspicion years before it arrived. Every report he had written was technically correct. Every recommendation defensible. Every failure explainable. When networks collapsed, he had already provided reasons. Enemy efficiency, compromised couriers, faulty radios. And because those explanations made sense, they endured. Suspicion without evidence was just rumor. The Washington, D.C. Across the Atlantic, CIA counterintelligence officers were growing impatient. Burgess and McLean's escape had confirmed their worst fears. A high-level mole existed, and he had been warned in advance. The British, however, were hesitant. To accuse Philby was to accuse their own system, and systems resist blame. A senior American officer pressed the issue during a closed-door meeting. "If it's not Philby," he asked bluntly, "then who is it?" The room fell silent. No one answered, because no one had a better candidate. Philby sensed the narrowing circle. He noticed the change in tone of questions, the subtle rephrasing, the repeated requests to clarify events he had already explained. He understood the danger instinctively. Not panic, not fear, but the cold calculation of time. He had reached the most dangerous phase of espionage, the phase where survival depended not on secrecy, but on credibility. Philby responded by doing nothing dramatic. He did not destroy documents. He did not flee. He did not overplay his hand. Instead, he leaned into his reputation. He volunteered for interviews. He offered detailed recollections. He admitted minor mistakes, harmless ones, creating the impression of honesty. And slowly, the pressure eased, not because doubts disappeared, but because institutions grow tired. But in late 1951, MI6 quietly removed Philby from sensitive operational roles. Officially, it was a routine reassignment. Unofficially, it was containment. He was no longer trusted, but he was not condemned either. The perfect limbo. Years passed. Philby worked as a journalist in the Middle East, reporting on politics, revolutions, and power struggles. From Beirut, he continued his contact with Moscow, less frequently, more cautiously, but still effectively. He was no longer at the center of Western intelligence, but he was not finished. In Washington, James Jesus Angleton never forgot him. Angleton believed in patterns the way others believed in evidence. And Philby, to him, was a pattern that never resolved. But Angleton also understood the limits of proof. You could feel betrayal. You could suspect it. You could even know it. But without confirmation, the system could do nothing. The Cold War moved on. New crises emerged. New spies were recruited. New secrets were guarded. And Kim Philby remained free, not because he was innocent, but because he had built his life so carefully that guilt alone was not enough to destroy him. The cracks were visible now, but the structure still stood, for the moment. January 1963. Beirut, Lebanon, early evening. The Mediterranean was calm that night, the surface of the water reflecting the last pale light of dusk. From the balcony of his modest apartment, Kim Philby watched the harbor in silence, a cigarette burning slowly between his fingers. The city below hummed with traffic and conversation, unaware that one of the Cold War's most damaging secrets was about to slip away. Philby had been here for years now, officially a journalist, unofficially a man in exile. Beirut suited him. It was cosmopolitan, chaotic, and porous. Spies passed through constantly. No one asked too many questions. But this time was different. This time, the questions were no longer subtle. In London, new evidence had finally surfaced. A Soviet defector had spoken. Names were whispered again. Old files reopened, this time with more urgency than caution. The pattern that Angleton had sensed years earlier was beginning to solidify into something dangerously close to proof. Mi-6 sent a message to Beirut. Philby was to return to London for consultations. He read the cable twice, then he poured himself a drink. Philby understood immediately what this meant. There would be no dramatic arrest, no handcuffs at the airport. The British did not do things that way, not with men like him. Instead, there would be polite interviews, repeated questions, long pauses, and eventually, the quiet end of a career. Or worse, he had survived suspicion before, but this time, the margin was gone. That night, Philby contacted his Soviet handlers. The message was brief, coded, final. That the situation is critical. Moscow responded quickly. Extraction was approved. The escape was almost mundane. No gunfire, no chase, no last-minute dash down a runway. One evening, Philby left his apartment as he always did. Same coat, same route, same unremarkable pace. He walked toward the waterfront, blending into the crowds of dock workers and sailors. Somewhere along the way, he disappeared. By the time Mi-6 realized what had happened, it was too late. Kim Philby was gone. Within weeks, he surfaced in Moscow, alive, safe, and finally exposed. The reaction in the West was not shock. It was something worse, confirmation. In Washington, James Jesus Angleton read the report in silence. When he finished, he did not speak. He did not react. He simply closed the file. To Angleton, Philby's defection was not a revelation. It was vindication and condemnation. The scale of the damage began to emerge slowly. Decades of compromised operations. Hundreds of agents exposed. Entire intelligence strategies rendered meaningless. Men who had trusted Philby had been betrayed at the deepest level. Some had died because of him. Others had lived long enough to realize they had been sacrificed. In Moscow, Philby was welcomed as a hero. He was given an apartment, a pension, a rank he had never officially held. But victory came with a price. He was no longer a spy. He was a symbol. And symbols are often lonelier than traitors. Philby drank heavily. He struggled to adapt to life in the country he had served so faithfully from afar. The reality of Soviet life did not match the ideology he had embraced as a young man in Cambridge. But there was no return now. There never had been. Back in the West, the damage did not end with Philby's escape. It deepened mistrust, hardened suspicion, justified purges. Every failure after that was viewed through the same lens. What if there is another Philby? The perfect spy had finally revealed himself, but he had done so on his own terms, and the Cold War, already poisoned by fear, absorbed the lesson eagerly. Trust was no longer a virtue, it was a vulnerability. Mid-1963, Washington, D.C., late night. The building was quiet, in the way only government offices are after midnight. The hum of fluorescent lights, the distant echo of a cleaning cart, the faint smell of paper and stale coffee lingering in the air. James Jesus Angleton sat alone. On his desk lay a single file. Thin now. Most of the contents had already been read, reread, cross-referenced, and absorbed into memory. The name on the cover needed no label. Philby. Angleton closed the folder slowly, as if the act itself carried weight. For years he had suspected this ending, not hoped for it, not feared it, simply expected it. In his mind, Philby had never been a question of if, only when. Now the when had arrived, and it brought no satisfaction. Philby's defection confirmed the unthinkable. The West's most trusted institutions had been compromised at the highest level. not by force, not by ideology alone, but by patience. The damage assessments began quietly. Operations were reviewed. Losses tallied. Names revisited. In Eastern Europe, entire chapters of intelligence history were rewritten with grim clarity. Networks that had collapsed mysteriously were now understood. Arrests once blamed on bad luck were reclassified as betrayals. The truth spread slowly, like poison through water. Some of the men Philby betrayed were already dead, executed after show trials, shot in prison yards, worked to death in labor camps whose names never appeared on maps. Others were alive, and learning, years later, why everything they had trusted had failed them. There were no apologies that could reach them. In London, MI6 absorbed the blow with practiced restraint. Publicly, nothing was said. Privately, everything changed. Recruitment procedures tightened. Vetting became obsessive. Informal trust, once the backbone of British intelligence, was replaced by layers of verification and doubt. The institution survived, but it was no longer the same institution Philby had entered. In Moscow, the celebration faded quickly. Philby was paraded, interviewed, praised, but never truly embraced. He had served the Soviet Union brilliantly, but he was also a reminder of something uncomfortable. That loyalty, once tested by reality, could fracture. He was given medals he did not wear, a rank that meant little, a place that never quite felt like home. The ideological certainty that had driven him in Cambridge decades earlier had eroded. The Soviet Union he now lived in was not the ideal he had imagined. It was bureaucratic, suspicious, watching him as closely as he once watched others. He had crossed the line, but he had not found peace on the other side. The Cold War moved forward relentlessly. New crises replaced old ones. New spies replaced the fallen. New secrets were guarded with deeper fear. But the lesson of Philby lingered like a scar. The greatest damage he inflicted was not tactical. It was psychological. After Philby, trust itself became suspect. Colleagues watched one another more closely. Friendships thinned. Institutions turned inward, convinced that betrayal could always be hiding behind competence. The ghost hunt intensified, and with it, the quiet destruction of initiative, creativity, and human judgment. Years later, historians would argue over numbers. How many agents died? How many operations failed? How much ground the West truly lost? But those debates missed the deeper cost. Philby proved that the Cold War was not decided solely by weapons or ideology. It was decided by access, and access, once given freely, could never be fully taken back. Kim Philby died in Moscow in 1988. There was no state funeral, no great reckoning, no final confession that could balance the scales. Just an aging man, remembered differently depending on which side of history you stood on. To some, he was a hero. To others, a traitor. To the intelligence services he hollowed out from within, he was something worse. A mirror. Because Philby did not succeed by being extraordinary. He succeeded by being trusted. And that is what made him the most dangerous spy of them all.